week on Just Solutions. The midterm elections saw large turnout around the country. Voters were deciding on everything from ballot measures to local and federal races. Young women especially showed up at the ballot box, and analysts say that this was in large part due to the attacks on reproductive rights. Our guest today is Virginia Kase Solomón, CEO of the League of Women Voters. The organisation is more than 100 years old and has more than 750 local leagues in all 50 states. Its mission is empowering voters, defending democracy. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Virginia, it's so good to have you with us. Thank you very much for being our guest on Just Solutions.
Thank you for having me. So excited to be here.
Well, we are in the aftermath of the midterm elections, albeit it's not completely finished. Of course, there is the runoff election in Georgia in that Senate race, and official election results still need to be certified. But I do want to get your first impressions on how the midterms played out. All reports seem to show that young people, and particularly young women and women in general, played a massive role in the midterm elections, showing out in force. What's your sense of who came out to vote, voter turnout in the most recent elections?
Well, first of all, it was a very interesting election. I think the amount of data that we're still going through is going to tell a story much different than what the polls said. So I think that's first and foremost most important to mention. And then as far as who came out, look, women and young people showed up at the ballot box, and it was just an incredible turnout for youth voters. The overall midterm election rate was 46%. And so that's slightly down from 2018, the most other, recent midterm, which was just over 50%. But this was still the second highest turnout rate in 50 years. So I think, again, while it might not have been as high as 2018, still the second highest turnout rate in 50 years. And so it tells a great story about people's enthusiasm not waning.
Well, obviously, the fact that we saw so many women, and particularly young women, showing out seems to have a direct connection to the recent Supreme Court decision in the Dobbs case, essentially rolling back reproductive rights. I know that this is something many election watchers and reproductive rights and healthcare advocates were saying this will have an impact in the midterms. What's your sense on the impact of the Dobbs decision on voter turnout?
I mean, it was incomparable, right? I mean, the only other thing that I could say showed up nearly as close or maybe slightly more was inflation in the economy. And that's just a reality in every election. Economics play a major role in every election. But there were a lot of people who thought prior to the election, and again, going back to some of the polls, that motivation had waned around the Dobbs decision. And that was not what we were hearing on the ground. And so it was good to know that women still were as motivated as they were. The polls were not right, and women decided to show up. But it wasn't just about who they were voting for. It was also about those ballot measures that we saw. Voters in Michigan, Kentucky, California, Montana, and Vermont all backed ballot measures supporting reproductive rights on election day. And so the fact that these voters were affirming abortion rights tells a huge story as well about where the country is headed.
And it was so interesting as well because it really crossed party lines. And I think that was a surprise, certainly for the Republican Party, that this is an issue that has galvanized voters, women voters across the country, regardless of political affiliation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, can you imagine how hard it must have been to be in that Republican war room the day after and starting to realize that they got it wrong? They underestimated women and people who support women, right? This was not just about women voters, but this was also about any other individual who could get pregnant, the trans community, for example, and men, people who were not prepared to be fathers, and those joint decisions being made by couples around whether or not they should proceed with a pregnancy or address health risks related to pregnancy, right? And so you saw a lot of people who felt like this was an important issue for themselves and for their autonomy, not only for women, for our bodies, but also for other people who love women, who also understand that there's an important family decision being made that's impacts other family members.
We've spoken on the show in the past to abortion rights activists, and we've talked a lot about how messaging around this issue is really crucial. Was there different kind of messaging, do you think, whether it was around ballot issues or candidates? Because I have seen a little bit of a shift that we're now talking about this being a public health issue. And also choice, of course, but really talking about the health implications of what abortion is, that it is, in fact, healthcare, where in years gone by, it's very much focused on a moralizing issue. Do you think a change in messaging has had an impact in this, or really is this just reflective of the fact that people are embracing reproductive rights regardless of where they live in the country and regardless of their political affiliation?
Well, I think there's a lot of complexity, right? Because for some, it is still a moral argument. But I think increasingly, you are correct. People are saying to themselves, hold up here. We really have this, I think, important reminder that we've gotten in this election as a country, that not everybody votes based on religion or their very specific, moral values when it comes to this issue. That is very much a health-centered issue. I would also say that from a moral standpoint, many people found it immoral that a child who had been raped in the state of Florida, for example, at the age of 12, was unable to access an abortion in that state. When people look at some of those states where there have been trigger laws, where we've seen egregious situations happening, putting the lives of mothers at risk, I think the conversation has changed in a very different way. And I don't think that people on the right, specifically the Republican Party, really were able to think through the implications of the Supreme Court decision and how that would play out in their campaigns.
Well, another huge group that turned out to the polls were young people. And so what is your sense on that? I know that you've been involved in activism for many, many years, and you started as a young activist yourself and have worked in so many different areas around this. What galvanized that youth vote? What got those young people out to cast their ballots?
So one of the things, I think one of the great stories about this election is how many young people are taking control and agency over their decisions at the ballot box. They're not waiting for somebody to make decisions for them. And not only are they not waiting for people to make decisions for them, and I'm speaking specifically around Gen Z here, but they're running for office, right? You see in the youngest person elected to Congress from the state of Florida, for example. So not only are young people coming out and having their voices heard, but they're also electing young people to office. And I think that's really critical and important. And I will say some of this is generational, right? Those Gen Xers that many people have cast aside. There's always these jokes about how Gen Xers were, kind of the indifferent generation. These are the children of Gen Xers. And they've learned what they think is right, what they think is wrong. And they also are ready to act on those issues in a way that is really showing up in a really powerful way. I'm actually most excited about what I see with this next generation of voters.
Well, a huge part of the work of the League of Women Voters is, of course, advocating for voting rights. And in many ways, voting and voting rights, those were issues that were actually on the ballot in so many different races around the country. In fact, there were, I believe, about 300 election deniers running for various federal and state offices. And they did not win, particularly in some of the battleground states that we had seen those election denial conspiracy theories abound as a result of the 2020 election. Give us a sense of how democracy itself, how voting rights, and the very integral nature of how we conduct our voting, how that showed up on the ballot in the midterm elections.
So I think it's important to just say that voters showed up despite the anti-voter laws, despite mis and disinformation campaigns, despite the election deniers, and even, poll worker shortages. American voters showed up to have their voices heard. And I think that's the most important top line message. I think the other thing is that election day or election season really proved the strength of the American voter and that our democracy is still strong, because early vote out early voter turnout was actually a huge indicator for the enthusiasm that people had around the election. But I would say that it wasn't just about voters' power. It was also about the resilience of voters to overcome some really oppressive state laws that have been put into place in many states. And it was also about voters becoming more savvy, right? Not being willing to fall prey and victim to some of that mis and disinformation. So it wasn't just the resilience, but it was also, the savviness that people have seen some of these playbooks already, and they're not going to fall for it again. And I think that's something that's important to note.
I mean, what you were saying there, it really emphasizes that people showed up at the ballots not because of our voting system, but almost despite the voting system and the obstacles that had been put in place, because there have been so many efforts to dissuade voters from showing up. Of course, the voter suppression measures in so many state legislatures, the erosion of the Voting Rights Act. There are so many examples of how it's gotten harder to vote, and particularly for certain groups. So really, if we look at the election turnout in the midterms, it's despite our voting system, not because of, that we're seeing people actually show up and cast their ballots.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we have to do in this country, do a better job of, is making sure that we're expanding access to the ballot. For example, when you look at early voter turnout, and mind you, this was the third election where you had different rules. 2018 was not the same as 2020. 2022 is not the same as 2020. We saw that there were different rules for the past 3 elections now. And so voters had to overcome any confusion, any challenges. Voters had to overcome, again, some of these egregious anti-voter laws, challenges to their voter registration status. I mean, you saw time and time again where voters were trying to overcome, again, like you said, despite. But now it's time to put good laws in place. It shouldn't be despite. It shouldn't feel as though it is such a challenge. Voting should be joyful. This is the one opportunity that we get every few years to be able to have our voices heard, to elect our leaders, and to decide on the issues that matter to us. So the next step now for those people who have been elected into office is to hold them accountable for making sure that the laws in each state and at the national level are there to support voters, not make it more challenging.
Well, we would love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching. How did the midterm elections play out where you live? What was your experience with voting? We'd love for you to join the conversation on social media. Drop us a comment. Let us know your thoughts. Well, Virginia, I mean, we're talking about the fact that we had huge turnout, but if you look at other democracies, we're still not anywhere close to really engaging everyone who can vote in this country. And of course, there are the barriers that are in place that we've talked about, the laws that have been put in place, the voter suppression movement, really, in many ways. But how do we get more people to vote in the midterms? If we look at comparable voter turnout with other democracies, almost 50%, it's still not great, albeit it might be good for midterms here in the US. But what needs to happen to really get voters to show up here in the US?
I think there are a few different things. One is, and my good friend, the Bishop William Barber, who runs the Poor People's Campaign and Repairers of the Breach, we've had this conversation quite a bit, and especially around poor and low wealth voters. Oftentimes, and they're a huge part of the electorate, nobody asks. In so many cases, we find that no candidates are actually going to the communities where people live and saying, hey, I want you to vote for me. Here's why. Here's what's going to change. Nobody's taken the time to really understand what the issues are for people today that people are facing. And so if people think that their lives aren't going to change, or their vote isn't going to be made or if they're not asked to vote, oftentimes people won't. And so what we need to do is create opportunities to have more access, to have more engagement, to really better understand the power of the vote for poor and low wealth people. I think that's one. I think some of the messaging around elections for young people, this generation, again, I think we're going to continue to see an increase in youth voter turnout, because this group of young people, this generation of young people, are just completely remarkable in their resolve to make sure that they are playing a part in the improvement of this country, and playing a part in the changes that they want to see happen. But it still needs to be more outreach. And then again, I think the last but not least is making it easier for people to vote. Voting should be a national holiday, for example. Why is it so hard for people to be able to go and vote and cast their ballot? We should have a lot of systems in place that are similar. So regardless, it's not this disproportionate, if you're in this state, you can get a mail-in ballot. If you're in this state, you have early voting. And if you're in this state, you only can do it between these hours on election day. It makes absolutely no sense. And so really putting systems and policies in place that make it convenient and more easy for people to vote, I think the greater we'll see the participation and turnout over the coming years.
I mean, just what you're saying there, I mean, the fact that we don't have automatic voter registration, like instead of that being the default that you have to almost opt out, you have to actually jump through quite a few hoops to get on the voter registration list in the first place. And then, of course, as we've seen as part of the voter suppression tactics, that doesn't even guarantee that you're going to get a chance to cast your ballot. There have been so many challenges to that, and very strategically done in certain states. But I do want to talk about that issue that you raised there. And I'm so glad that you raised the point that around Dr. Barber and what's happening with the Poor People's Campaign, because I think so much of their work is really trying to break through this idea of voter disengagement. It's often referred to as voter apathy. I don't like that term, because it's not that people are apathetic, it's that people have been so let down by the system that when people are voted into office, they're not representing the interests of people in their constituency. So often that goes to gerrymandering or money in politics and different things, but people feel disengaged from the process. And so that seems to me then we need candidates who are more reflective of our society. What are your thoughts on that, and how many of those candidates potentially have been elected now in state, in local, and of course in federal offices now as a result of the midterms? What if we got candidates who were more reflective of people in community? Would that go some way to break through some of that voter disengagement?
Oh, I absolutely think that you're 100% correct. We need a more representative democracy that is more reflective of our country. Part of the challenge, though, is that it's become so hard to run for office. It's become so expensive to run for office. And so I don't think you can disconnect money in politics and the challenges around dark money and campaign contributions. All of those things go hand in hand. So if people see that they can't get elected, I mean, it's very rare that you see somebody like an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right, who only takes those small dollar donors. Not everybody does that. And it makes it very, very difficult when people can put in millions and millions of dollars into a race. And it doesn't matter. It could be a statewide race, and it could be money coming from outside of that state. Whether it's a federal race, every state is very different around what the rules are, and the federal rules are even different, right? So even the way that the consistency on how campaigns are financed, it just makes it so difficult that it's a turnoff. People assume in many ways that they're just not going to win because it's going to be the amount of money that it would take. And then the other thing is how we think about how people run for office. Most people, unless you are independently wealthy, you own your own law firm or a consulting firm or something to that effect, can't take the time off to just go and campaign, you know what I mean, from work, unless you have the resources. So I think the way that we look at how we hold elections and how we find candidates, how we support candidates, especially people who maybe aren't wealthy, the better.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the work of the League of Women Voters. I think most people would associate you with the big presidential debates, but you have chapters all around the country. There's so much work that's being done on the ground in communities by the League of Women Voters, not just when it comes to big presidential elections or even the midterms, but very much at a hyper local effort. to really engage people in all aspects of democracy. Talk a little bit about what the League of Women Voters is doing right now in 2022.
So we are doing a ton of work. And I would say that the League actually dropped out of doing the presidential debates back in 1987 because the parties wanted to be more involved with the process. And that wasn't something the League was comfortable with. We feel like debate is a healthy and important part of our democracy, but it's only healthy when there's no interference from the political parties. So I just wanted to mention that. But we do debates all throughout the country at the federal, state, local and local level. And so that is one of the big things that we focus on at the League, is making sure that candidates can engage in healthy debate and putting together forums that are nonpartisan. Another thing that we do is educate voters. We have a voter education website called vote411.org. And that website is really a one-stop shop to get all of the information you need around your elections, whether it's if there's a ballot initiative, any additional ballot questions, the candidates finding out their platform, understanding if you're registered to vote, if not, getting registered to vote. All of those things can be done on Vote 411. We also have, in addition to our electoral work, which includes traditional get out the vote efforts, voter registration efforts, those are all things that the League does around voting rights. But we also engage in a lot of other work. One of those is what we call our Democracy Defense Fund and our democracy defense efforts. That's where we engage in litigation. When we see something that is wrong, protecting voters and voters' access is critically important. One of the most important cases we won this election, for example, was in Arizona, where we were able to block armed vigilantes from being able to patrol ballot boxes, which was very intimidating for voters. So those kinds of things, those cases are really important to make sure that voters feel safe and comfortable going to the ballot box. So our democracy defense. We have our Democracy Truth Project, which is combating mis, dis, and malinformation. We are engaging people in civics education. We know civics education has not been really at its best in this country, at least in our education system, for many decades. And so that loss of civics education, not everybody even understands how government and elections are supposed to work, which leaves people more susceptible to mis and disinformation. So combating that. And then the other things we do are advocacy work. We work with state legislatures, local elected leaders, and nationally elected leaders to help promote access to the ballot through lobbying and legislative work and legislative efforts. And then last but not least, we engage in organizing. The other thing that's really important for us is that we help people take control and agency of their lives. And we believe that building power through organizing is one of the ways to do that. And so we really help communities by going into those communities and being able to help people advocate for issues that they care about that impact their daily lives. And so those are the big things that we do across the country. And it's not just around voting rights legislation. I would add, last but not least, is that we also see that issues connect. There are many issues that connect to justice and environmental justice. If we do not have a healthy climate, it impacts elections. You saw what happened with the hurricane right prior to the election this year in Florida and the impact that it had on voters down there. We think about issues like reproductive health care and what that means for voters, especially people whose lives are now going to be dictated by this issue. So we see a way to connect day-to-day issues to democracy all the time, and we help to connect those dots for people.
I mean, from what you're saying there, Virginia, it really reminds me of what I hear so often from not just voting rights advocates, but, organizers of every stripe, is that democracy happens in between the elections. So many people think it's, I'll show up every 4 years and cast a vote for the presidency, or maybe I'll show up every 2 years and participate in elections that way. But it's what's happening every single day in communities that's what democracy is. And that seems to be a lot of what you're talking about there.
Absolutely. I mean, you think about the decisions that school boards are making over books, for example. If you think about what's happening at your local town council over water, or if you're thinking about just what's going to happen to roads and bridges in your communities, all of these things, school budgets, right? So, I mean, when you think about all of the things that impact us in our daily lives, those decisions are being made at the local level. And so the more that we can engage and help people be informed about what's happening in their communities, the better. But even better than that, we want citizen watchdogs, and not like in a frightening way, in a way where people are actually paying attention to what's happening in their government. So much of what happens, it's because nobody's paying attention. And so making sure that we're paying attention, we have people we call our league observers. So they go to these different town committee meetings. They show up at school board meetings. They show up at state committee hearings. Wherever they're able to publicly engage, we have league members who are going to learn about what's actually happening inside the government and then informing our fellow citizens.
Well, in the last couple of minutes that we have, Virginia, as we said, we're still in the immediate aftermath of the midterms, but when we have seen so many pieces of legislation in state legislatures around the country really trying to roll back voting rights, now we are on the cusp of a new legislative session. We'll have state legislators convening again in the coming weeks in the new year. What do people need to watch out for in their communities when it comes to voting rights? Because as we said, it's not just showing up every 2 years, every 4 years, but ensuring that democracy and the structure of democracy is there so that when we are participating in elections, the foundation is there. So what do people need to watch out for, either at a state level or a federal level, when it comes to voting rights?
So one of the things we are anticipating that hopefully, there's something called the Electoral Count Act that will be that has already been introduced, but that will hopefully make it through this Congress before the new legislative session, and that would change the way that the electoral count works, making it, shoring up some of those rules. We saw some of the things that led up to January 6th, so it would be tightening things up to make sure that it was elections at certification was held in a way that lacked that kind of threat. I think another thing that we need to be paying attention to is a case called Moore v. Harper. And so there are other, there are things that are happening in the courts right now which threaten the way that election systems are run. And so in this particular case, we're looking at North Carolina. Once again, North Carolina always ends up being in something, but where they're trying to change this, it's something called the state legislative theory, that state legislatures would be able to change the way elections are decided. And so that's another piece that I think is really important. And then last but not least, I would say all of these little rules, whether it's vote by mail, codifying vote by mail, a lot of people are going to be trying to get rid of it. So there's going to be this tension between what allows more people to have access and what is going to restrict access. And so people should really be paying attention to what's happening at the state level around laws that are being proposed to be changed. And then finally, I would say, if you go to lwv.org, you can join your local league. If you're somebody who is looking to be engaged as in your community, there are a lot of different opportunities to plug in, whether it's at the local level, the state level, or even at the national level. What we want to do is make sure that people have access to be engaged in this work, because we are all about advancing democracy. And for those people who want to join us, we welcome them.
Well, Virginia, thank you so much for being our guest today on Just Solutions.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we invite you, our viewers and our listeners, to join us again, same time, same place next week for another conversation from Free Speech TV's Just Solutions.